Hi and welcome, and the engine and gearbox is on the workbench. So the plan of action today is to remove the gearbox and the bell housing to reveal the flywheel and the clutch. So I'm going to remove the clutch, have a look at the condition of it. It's going to go back into the car because this car, I have no immediate plans to put this car on the road now. It's really just to do YouTube videos with. So I'm going to pop it back in again, and depending on the length of the video, whether I get time to then have a look at the gearbox. Now I would like to remove this end cover and have a look at the fifth gear, which is under there, and possibly the gearbox housing, so I can have a look at the condition of the teeth. Now I don't actually want to damage the gearbox or destroy it, so not sure where I'll go on that part and whether it'll be in this episode or the following episode, but I would like to have a look at that at some point. So for this video, if you need to ever change the clutch in your MINI R50, hopefully this one will give you an insight into what you've got to do and how you put it back together again. So hopefully you'll enjoy this one, and I'll crack on now. So I'll kick things off with a few photographs to show the main parts of the gearbox and the bell housing. So here we can actually see the gearbox in green, and all the transmission bolts are in red, and there's 7 of those plus 2 for the starter motor. And we can also see the clutch lever there in yellow. So in this one we can see the gearbox mount on the top and the gearbox fill and drain plugs in blue on the right hand side. And this one shows the clutch bracket, the 5th gear cover, the weighted gear change lever and the gear change cable bracket. And finally here's another view showing similar items, though you can see the 2 bolts for the starter motor. And this one shows you the inside of the flywheel bell housing, where you can see the clutch release bearing and the clutch release lever fork. And a final view showing the diaphragm spring on the flywheel, and you can just see the clutch barely visible in the middle. So the first part to be removed is the cable bracket for the gear change cables. So with a 10mm socket we can start to undo these 3 bolts. Notice there one of them's actually got a little bracket on, and that's got a cable tie there for some of those power cables that went down to the power steering pump. So that's the one with the little bracket on, which ironically that cable tie is trapped between the gearbox and the engine, so I'm presuming this clutch has been changed, or the gearbox has been changed at some point. So all 3 bolts appear to be the same length, and there's a little plastic end cap there on a ball joint, which is for lifting the gear change lever up and down. Definitely don't want to lose that bit. So I'll now go on to removing the gearbox top mount. So using a 13mm socket, these were quite tight, so you may need a breaker bar for this. Now I've used an extension there, obviously it'd be easier without using an extension, but I do that just so that the camera can see more of what I'm doing. But logically you would use no extension on that at all, because it would make it a lot easier to get some leverage. So that aside, so this is 4 bolts here. That's the 3rd one, and then the final one. Now this engine mount actually appears to be okay, or gearbox mount. It's probably the only mount that is actually okay on this car. So that's the mount off. We'll have a quick look at that. So another aluminium casting, and it doesn't appear to be split, which is good news. We'll check the other side, just see if I can see any splits. Nope, that all looks good, thankfully. So on to removing the clutch slave brackets. So this is a 10mm socket. As you can see, I actually did get the slave cylinder off this bracket in the end without damaging anything, but it sure did take some work. So I have put plenty of copper slip on these now, somewhat paranoid about them seizing up again. So there's our little bracket there, and another casting. So while I'm at it, I think I will check the magnetic filler plug on the gearbox for any swarf. So using a 17mm socket or spanner, we'll just undo this just to see what might be stuck on the magnet out of interest. And we do have some metal debris there, not a lot, but we have got some there, so we'll give that plug a little bit of a clean and pop it back in. So there is a copper washer there which presumably should be replaced as well, but for the moment we'll just pop that back in, and we will have to put our gearbox oil back at some point. So we can now remove the gearbox and the clutch housing from the engine block. So we require a 15mm socket for this, and definitely a breaker bar. So there is 7 bolts, 2 of which have already been loosened when the starter motor was removed. So we have still got the 7 remaining to remove. Again, I'm using an extension bar here purely because the engine is on a table and you do need to get into that. I'm constantly checking the bolt lengths as well, just in case one of them was shorter. And I'm also trying to do it in a slightly diagonal manner, because they normally advise removing most bolts in a diagonal manner. So we'll do that anyway. So there's one tucked around here at the back. So that's the 2 starter motor bolts. Again, checking for length. So they do all seem to be the same length, these bolts. And then we've got one bolt tucked away down here. That was quite tight. And there go the bolts on the floor. So always a good idea to put all your bolts in a little magnetic dish. Right, so we get this one out. A little bit more awkward. Again, checking for length. So I'll then go back round to the other side now and do this final one over here. So when it comes to actually the last bolt, it's well worth leaving one in loose that you can remove by hand, because you don't want this gearbox suddenly just dropping. And be careful of the thermostat housing here. See, that could have easily broken that. So you do need a bit of an extension on that. Or you could just turn it from the other side. So I'm just going to pop that one back in and keep it loose. So that's like my safety bolts when the final assembly all comes apart, as it's doing now. So it's starting to move now. I'm trying to keep it there with my leg. Right. Definitely paranoid about one of those bolts being longer than the others. So getting everything ready now, because these are quite heavy. So just undo that last bolt, holding it there with my knee, and we'll just pull it away now. And there's the flywheel and the diaphragm spring, and we can see the release bearing there. Looks all pretty dirty in there. I think we definitely need to give some things a bit of a clean. And we have actually got a date on that diaphragm spring of 2012. So I thought I might try and do a starter motor demonstration. So having put the oil back in the engine, we'll now just pop the starter motor on. And there's two parts to a starter motor. You've got the actual motor and a solenoid. So when you turn the ignition key, it triggers the solenoid, which is basically like a relay in there as well. So it will fire the pinion out, and at the same time it will supply the larger current to the starter motor, because the starter motor needs a huge amount of power. So that's just the relay clicking away there, and as it does that, it fires the pinion out. Now it also turns on the starter motor, but I haven't put any power onto that terminal yet. So that's how it functions, the solenoid. Okay, so we now put some serious power on for the starter motor. So as this solenoid switches it on, it will also fire the starter motor as well. So we'll see what happens now. And there we go. Solenoid, the pinion's stuck there, so I've got to quickly disconnect that before it overloads the motor. So as it starts, it normally fires the pinion back in. So I'm just going to confirm now I've got the correct alignment tool for this clutch. So this is the Laser 7484, and it's for the Midlands transmission, which presumably is what's on my car. So I just want to confirm that is the correct one before I start taking the clutch off. And that appears to be a nice snug fit. So presumably that is correct. Now there is a second tool if you have the later G-Trag transmissions. So I'm just going to check this as well, see what the difference is. Yes, and that's quite loose. So that's for the black Mini I've got as well, which I've got to take the gearbox off. So hence the reason I have two of them. But that's definitely the right one for this. So I'll give you a few measurements here, just for use, and that's 17.7 millimeters. That's the part that goes into the clutch. And the part that goes around the diaphragm, I'll try and measure that. Just give you an idea of the size of the entry hole. And that's 28.3 millimeters. Okay, so let's remove the clutch. So before we begin, the pressure plate does need to be undone in a cross-diagonal manner. Okay, so I'm just going to mark the flywheel to the diaphragm, because obviously I'm going to replace this. I'm not putting a new one on. So for that reason, they do suggest you mark them so that diaphragm spring goes back in the same position. Now, I had a problem here. I've got one E8 socket, and that is going to damage the head if I try and turn it, because it's going at an angle. So clearly you need a slim one for this, which I didn't have. So I then started to have a bit of a panic and thought, how am I going to actually get this thing off? And lucky enough I had a spanner, an E8 spanner, but it was tiny, and I wasn't going to just undo it that easily. So obviously I do need to lock the flywheel in position. Now again, this tool wasn't actually the correct size, so it didn't fit in like it should fit in. So I took a bit of a gamble there, put it at an angle just to lock it. Obviously there is a risk you could break teeth on the flywheel, which would be quite disastrous. And I was struggling to undo these 6 E8 Torx bolts. So I was trying to do a bit of dodgy levering there, but it did work. So you definitely want a slim socket. So I'm trying to maintain the diagonal pattern that you're supposed to undo this in, which I did include a photo earlier in this video to show that pattern, because you have got to gradually undo this bit by bit. I think that's probably more the case if you're going to be replacing this spring with the old one. Perhaps if you're putting a new one on, then you don't need to worry about this pattern of undoing. So it's quite stiff there. I'm surprised that little spanner didn't snap. So I'm obviously going to have to order the correct slim socket when it comes to putting this back on, because there's no way I'm going to get this on properly. And it does need to be torqued up as well. So anyway, I'll speed up now. We're just undoing these with my silly little spanner in the correct order. Okay, so I can use the socket that doesn't properly fit now, just to finally remove this diaphragm spring. This was a bit of a problem because it would have slowed down my recording. I'd have had to have stopped basically and waited till the correct socket arrived. So I knew I had to get this off somehow, even while a new socket was on order. So that's the diaphragm spring off now, and there's our clutch. Now note the way it's actually located, because it's got to go back on the same way. So the protruding springs are on the gearbox side, and the thinner side is on the flywheel. There's definitely plenty of dust there, so you probably want to be putting a mask on with this. Now Haynes do say don't use petroleum products to wash this down with, use methylated spirits. Now I'm presuming this is on the assumption that these did contain asbestos. Now I don't think they do anymore, but just as a precaution, you definitely don't want to be using compressed air to blow all this dust around the room. So once it's all cleaned off, you then need to put this sort of methylated spirits and dust in a separate container and take that to recycling, just in case it actually contained asbestos. Well, there we go. So that's looking okay. It's looking cleaner now. Like I said, I'm going to capture this, and it mustn't go into normal waste. It has to go to recycling. So the correct socket has now arrived, next day as well. So this is the correct socket. So that's an E8 long and slim socket, and for the purpose of just demonstrating, I've popped the diaphragm spring and the clutch back on. Now I'm going to try and show the correct sequence of undoing this with the camera facing the end, now that I can actually do it properly, because the spanner was a bit of a disaster. But I thought I'd keep that in the video just to show that it can be undone, but that is definitely not the way to do it. You want the right tool for the job. So there's the clutch, and it's all nice and clean now. Okay, so here's another little, just show you that slim socket and why it needs to be slim. I'll put a link to that in the bottom of the video in case you need to order one. So it might be worth seeing a quick photo of the parts of the clutch, and here we can see the load damper springs, the hub, the friction linings and the friction lining rivets. And if we have a look at a cross-sectional view, we can see the multiple damper springs there, the metal spring cushion in between the two friction linings, and the central hub. And another slightly different angle here, just to show that the spring section is clearly protruding on one side. So the job of those four springs is to try and reduce the torsional shock and engine vibrations, noise and rattles when the clutch is engaged and disengaged. Now it might be worth measuring the linings of the friction material to see how much life is actually left on this. So there's the protruding springs, and that is, wait for the aircraft to go over. Certainly some activity going on out there. I'll just get my calipers ready. So you measure from the rivet, wait for the next one to go, measure from the top of the rivet to the top of the friction material. Now you want at least 1 millimeter on there. And do we get more than a millimeter? No. We get 0.76. So this clutch should be replaced. We'll take a couple of measurements. This is the gearbox side, because the springs are protruding, which is the side you are supposed to measure, and that's 0.81. So again, it's definitely less than 1 millimeter. Now just for the hell of it, I'll measure the flywheel side and just see what we get there. Perhaps we get less wear on the flywheel side. And we do. 0.93 millimeters. Definitely a lot of flying activity today in Wales. Hot weather's out. Right then, with them all calmed down, we can now have a look in a bit more detail with a bit less noise. So there, hopefully you can clearly see the makeup of the clutch disc and the multiple springs. You've got inner springs there and outer springs. And this is the diaphragm spring with the little metal fingers. Now that's clearly looking worn in the centre where the release bearing makes contact. So things are definitely worn out here. So we'll show what actually happens when you push the clutch in. It pushes that release bearing in towards the diaphragm spring, like so. And it would push on those and basically pop the clutch away from the flywheel, enabling you to change gear. So the release bearing seems to be okay, but those would normally be changed as well at the same time as the clutch. So just showing where the bearing sits. Obviously would spin around because all this would be spinning on the flywheel, and the bearing would normally be stationary until you change gear. So onto removing the flywheel to view the crankshaft end seal. Obviously don't do this unless you actually do need to replace the seal. So we do need to loosen the flywheel in a gradual and progressive manner, and here's a photo showing that pattern. So we crack on here. So that's a 13mm socket and definitely a breaker bar, because these have been tightened to 80 Newton meters. That's because it's the Cooper model. It would be 90 Newton meters if it was the S. So I'm just going to mark the diagonal pattern that you're supposed to undo these with. It does make it easier and prevents any confusion. So I'm basically just breaking all the bolts in this order, and then I'll undo them gradually a bit more each time. I will speed this up. Could get a bit tedious. Right, so those bolts are now loose, so we should be free to now just ratchet them off. You can see the bell housing there on the left is nice and clean. I was busy working away at that for quite a while. But anyway, back to the flywheel. Now these have actually been thread locked with a bit of blue thread lock. and the manual doesn't mention using thread lock at all, so I'm not sure why they've used blue thread lock, but they have. Now I'm just going to clean the dust off this in the centre part of the flywheel, because again, on the assumption it could be asbestos, it shouldn't be, but it could be. So I'm just going to clean that off, obviously get rid of the numbers as well, and then I'm also going to mark the flywheel to the centre of the crankshaft, because the flywheel does have to go back on in the right spot. Now there is a couple of dimples that should be on here once I remove the flywheel, but just in case there wasn't, I've put my own markings on there. You can see that blue thread lock on those threads. Right, so I'm just going to loosen the flywheel. I've still kept one bolt in so it doesn't fall off on the floor or something silly. So I'll just tap it around now with a gentle mallet. You can hear the tone change as it starts to get loose. Right, so we're definitely loose. We should be able to take that single bolt out now and brace ourselves for the weight, because these are quite heavy. And there we go. And there's our crankshaft seal, and thankfully there's no sign of oil. So this seal seems to be still working, unless that's what they had. Perhaps they had a new seal fitted at some point. There's definitely no oil signs there, so that seal seems to be all good. So I'll just give this flywheel a bit of a clean up. There's the dimple that's on the crankshaft. Just mark that with a bit of yellow, and there's the other dimple on the reverse of the flywheel, which I'll mark there. So you've got to make sure those are lined up when you come to put the flywheel back on. Obviously I've made my own white marks as well. So refitting the flywheel, and new bolts must be used. So make sure the surface of the crankshaft is perfectly clean and no debris is left on there, because the flywheel obviously needs to sit perfectly flat against that. Give a little wipe on the flywheel side. Now we can line the dimples up, which I've coloured yellow. If I, so you can see the inner dimple and the flywheel dimple, and thankfully they line up with the white marks that I've already added myself as a extra safety measure. So we can pop the bolts in. Now, like I said, it doesn't mention thread lock anywhere. As you probably can see, I am actually adding a little bit of blue thread lock because it was already there, and also I'm reusing the bolts, which you're not supposed to do. But anyway, like I said, this car is just for YouTube, and here is the tightening pattern that we now need to use. Very similar to the untightening pattern. So again, just to make life a little bit easier, for those of us that forget easily, I'm going to write the tightening sequence directly on the flywheel. There we are, the 8 bolts. So I now need to re-lock the flywheel and put my little tool in the opposite direction to stop it rotating clockwise. And now I can start to just take up the slack in these bolts. Obviously spinning in a lot easier with the thread lock on. So presumably somebody knew why they put thread lock on before me, so assuming they knew what they were doing, I'm just copying. So for this car it's 80 Newton meters to tighten these two. If it's the Cooper S, it would be 90 Newton meters. Whoop, nearly lost the engine. So bolt number 3 and 4, 5, 6. It's good for counting this. 7, and lastly number 8. That's the flywheel back on. Right then, So, refitting the clutch and the diaphragm spring. So when we do replace the diaphragm spring, we do need to tighten the bolts in a cross-diagonal sequence. So make sure the flywheel surface is nice and clean and it's not scratched and scored or damaged in any way. And again, I'm just going to clean the diaphragm spring part. So I get my laser 7484 alignment tool out, like so. So make sure the protruding part is on the gearbox side, like that. Now I've got to line up the marks because I'm obviously reusing these parts, which probably doesn't make a lot of sense considering getting to a clutch is extremely difficult. But like I say, this car is turning out to be just for YouTube now. So gradually it's going to get taken apart bit by bit. Okay, so we can put in our alignment tool like so. Line up the diaphragm spring with my marks and push it in. So we can now use our proper Torx Star E8 socket, which is nice and slim, to put these bolts back in correctly. Now you just need to put them in loose at first because the clutch plate must be able to move. So you just want to get them all in place like so. I'm doing it in the correct sequence, which you should follow. Now it's too tight now, so I'm just going to loosen them all very slightly just so I get some movement on that clutch. Right, so it's moving now, so I can reseat the alignment tool, knowing that it's all nice and free, and then gradually tighten them in the correct sequence. And again, I'm going to write the numbers on the actual diaphragm so I remember. Okay, so I'll start by hand, just taking up the slack gradually, like so, and then I can move on to the torque wrench. So for this it's 20 Newton meters, but there are different sized bolts. It's 23 Newton meters for the M8 bolts and it's 28 Newton meters for the M9 bolts, depending on the size that you might have. So there's our first click, our second click, doing the counting again, third, fourth, fifth, and finally sixth. So that should be all in place, and if nothing else it's clean. So just remove my tool again and that should be job done. Okay, so here's a few reference photographs. So I'll start this with a photo of the bell housing before it was cleaned, and then a photo showing the flywheel with the diaphragm all in one piece, and a couple here showing the starter motor pinion gear not engaged in the flywheel. And here's the diaphragm spring, clearly worn there from the clutch release bearing, and here's the other side showing the plate. A couple of photos showing the bell housing since it's been cleaned, and there's a nice clean release bearing. And this one just shows the clutch sitting on the gearbox input shaft. And here's the diaphragm spring with the clutch release bearing sat on top. And here's one very clean bell housing, clearly showing the clutch release fork. And this shows the crankshaft end seal, and the end has actually been cleaned. So quite a big seal that. And a couple of photos showing the flywheel and the markings inside it. And lastly, another photo showing that crankshaft end seal. And this was about the clutch and the flywheel on a MINI R50. Thank you for watching, and I hope this video helps you replace your MINI clutch if the need ever arises. This video was filmed and edited by me, Mark Savage, in July 2021. I can be found on Instagram and Facebook under Coats and Gators.